Welcome to Smith Weekly Discussions, an occasional program for our members of Smith Weekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine our show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience at Smith Weekly, including Mike P., Ryan S., at Inconvenient TR5, Mark R., and Andy S. We have a new guest on the program today. Mr. Thomas Nelson has joined the podcast. Tom is the producer of Climate, the movie, The Cold Truth, a documentary that calls into serious question the climate change narrative and behind the scenes agenda with a well-found set of rebuttals. Tom is also host of the Tom Nelson Podcast, a program that has had various guests dedicated to covering the climate show. You can learn more about Tom and his work and even watch the movie via his website, climatethemovie.net. Mr. Nelson, welcome to Smith Weekly Discussions.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Why don't we dive right in here and have you start off by telling the audience about your background and experience, and of course, what events motivated you to organize and produce this documentary?
Okay, going way back, I would say around 2005 or so, I was just a normie where I was kind of believing what the mainstream media said. And if scientists said something, I would go along with it. So I kind of believed in the whole climate narrative back then. But then I'm a bird watcher, and there was this whole thing where there was a huge announcement in 2005 that the ivory-billed woodpecker had been rediscovered. It got enormous publicity in the birdwatching community, and there was a scientific paper with 17 authors. It was a big deal. But I checked into it and I found out that the evidence was just incredibly flimsy, and they had not actually rediscovered it. It was all a groupthink. So I was amazed at that science could be wrong, published science. But right around then, somebody said, they sent me an email and said, you should look at the climate change narrative. Same deal. If you look into that, you're going to find out that the evidence does not back this up at all. So that was many years ago that I looked into that. Within the first day that I looked into the climate change narrative for myself, I found out, yep, it's all flimsy. And eventually I found out that every single alarming thing that we're told, all of it is wrong. There's nothing at all going on alarming with the climate. So since then, I started working on Blogspot. I worked on Twitter, which later became X. And I started a podcast in 2022. So I've been kind of involved in the climate debate almost daily for all that time since around 05 or 06.
Yeah, it's interesting how we come across these things, and it's often by coincidence. And for us, we started off in mining and energy, natural resource sector, and then as a consequence of investment thesis and data collection and research, we had to naturally look at this too, because we had to understand, okay, what are the prevailing catalysts towards what we were looking at in the investment world? And so, of course, we had to spill into this. And then, of course, as you said, you slowly become aware through the process of just doing your own work that, boy, this just doesn't add up so well. And then, of course, you form conclusions about different sources of energy and what sources of energy are true, good sources of energy. Quality of energy is what I like to say to people. Quality of energy means everything. All these different pieces that come into this evaluation. And so it's an interesting one. And of course, that spurred us to want to discuss investment consequences as well as have guests that are looking in a similar direction that we are based on their own work and not just taking the broad narrative out there and believing that it's actually true. I think we were taught very early, including myself, very, very interestingly. I took a nutrition course when I was in university, and of course didn't learn a lot in university other than responsibility, Tom. But I remember the instructor in that course, also in a history course of mine, always question history and always question the labels on nutritional products and understand how to do that investigation, basically follow the money and these types of things. And of course, I want to come into this a little bit more and see how you came across the director of the movie, Martin, and his motivation to work with you in organizing this production. I want to start here too with the question that, certain people will probably try to call into question your motivations, Tom, and who funded you to put this movie out. It's obviously not a box office hit that people are paying to watch. So if you're not raising money off of this, at least at the box office. So talk about how you covered the costs to get this done and your true motivation for doing so.
Yeah, so my motivation all this time has been just to go after the scientific truth. So I'm proud to say that all the time I've spent on all this stuff since 2006, let's say, or my entire life, I haven't received a single cent of funding from anyone. I have done this all just on my own dime. And actually, of course, in this day and age, for me to do my podcast and for me to put stuff on X, et cetera, it's incredibly cheap. You don't really need money to do this stuff anymore. And as far as funding Climate the Movie, we just got private funding for that. Martin Durkin is very good at handling money. And he did not spend very much on this. We used stock footage and we spent some money on travel, but the people we interviewed in the movie were not paid at all. So we had to pay somewhat for people to do some editing, et cetera. But overall, it's a low budget movie. And I think Martin did just a fabulous job of producing a great movie just packed with facts without spending a lot of money.
I really appreciate the comments on that. There should be some folks out there that should be looking to reimburse your costs if you would accept, and really appreciate the efforts there. And I think that's the highlight is, once again, you're putting out efforts here that cost capital and also take a lot of risk as well. And so appreciate the comments on that. With respect to Martin Durkin, talk about his background here and why he took this on as a project of his to get this out, because obviously this is not his first time and he has quite a background dealing with other organizations, including, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, folks like National Geographic and so forth.
Yeah, my whole involvement in this and getting to meet Martin Durkin has been a total blast for me. That I started this podcast, the Tom Nelson podcast, in July of 22. And one of my first guests, maybe top 20 guest, was Martin Durkin. I was always a big fan of his 2007 film, The Great Global Warming Swindle. He just did a great job with that, and that one still holds up to this day. So I invited him to be on my podcast, and as we were talking early on in the podcast, he said, knowing what I know now, I'd like the chance to remake it, to make another movie on that same subject, because he didn't really have a lot of time to make that the first one, and he thought given some more time and some with the additional knowledge he has now, he could do a better job. So that kicked off the whole thing, and we got together. And within about a year or so, or a little later, he had gone ahead and made this new movie, Climate the Movie. And he just did a great job. He has so much experience now. He's been involved in maybe 100 plus documentaries. He's done a lot of stuff that's been on TV. And just with time, I think he's gotten better and better at it. A lot of people have given us great feedback on the movie in that it stays interesting. It's 80 minutes long, but it keeps you interested because he doesn't hang on any one thing too long. He puts a little humor in there. I just can't praise him enough. I did a lot of work in the background on the movie, but in terms of credit for doing the interviewing and writing the script and doing the narration, I would give pretty much all of that to him and his team.
Very well, Tom. Appreciate that and sharing the background and how you've established that relationship with Martin. I've watched it. Didn't seem like 80 minutes to me. And of course, we're long form here, so 80 minutes is no big deal. I know a lot of people struggle with long form these days, which is a problem in itself, but it was a great movie. It's acceptable to watch when you have some spare time over dinner or what have you. We found that it was quite well put together. I encourage everybody, whether you agree with this or not, to watch it and then try to actually do some work and figure out how you can pick it apart. And I'll tell you, you're going to struggle to do so. Anyway, I just encourage the audience to check it out. I've seen it myself. Encourage people to watch it irrespective of your position, and then come back, reevaluate, do some work, and see what you can come up with. So before we move into a couple areas of specific discussion, Tom, you've been spending a lot of time and effort on the continuance of what is now called climate change. And the reality is that climate's always existed. And that by way of passage of time, evolution, physics, natural forces that we don't fully understand, that's always changed. This is nothing new because it has been with us throughout human history, but it is perpetrated like it is new, like a new menu item at McDonald's. My question is to you how the climate change narrative has evolved as you've witnessed this and experienced it over your time on this matter, which of course you've been involved with for many years. Is the narrative falling apart, Tom? Is it getting worse? What's your take?
That is a great question, and I've been talking about that a lot. The narrative is crumbling. I'm very happy to see that it's crumbling. It's an evil narrative because it's being used to deny fossil energy to people in Africa. There's a lot of evil behind it, but it is crumbling. And I think one major thing that's happened is that over the last 4 years, A lot of people who kind of believed what was on their TV have found out that they were being lied to over and over on important stuff. Then they're asking, what else are they lying to us about? I've had a lot of people come up to me and say, this is the way it's happened for me, that I kind of believed the narrative on other stuff. And then now I started looking into climate and I found out right away they're lying to us. So there's a lot of specific things that have happened. Was a major climate outfit called Climate Nexus that they employed 30 or 40 people to pump out this propaganda. They just went under. Just in this month, they went under and they're no longer in business. And the Smog blog had something. There was something actually. Daily Costs had Climate Denier Roundup. They had something like 2,000 posts. That just went under. And when we see polling, you can see that people are clearly losing their faith or losing their belief in the narrative. Voting in the EU, that just happened this month, and the Green parties did not do well. I was told when I was just over there in Europe that they opened up voting to 16-year-olds because they thought they would be more likely to vote for the green ideas, but they didn't. The young folks did not go that way, and that was a surprise as well. So just as I look everywhere, I look at BlackRock. They mentioned climate change something like 29 times in a 2020 report that they put out. They put out the similar report this year, and they mentioned it 4 times. They're kind of backing away from the narrative. Larry Fink from BlackRock said he's not going to say ESG anymore, which is also related to the climate narrative, because that term has been poisoned. So over and over, as I look everywhere, I see a lot of encouraging signs that we are watching the climate narrative crumble in front of us. One other thing I want to mention is that major podcasters like Joe Rogan, there was a time when he had Candace Owens on there in maybe 2018, and his mind was blown when she said she didn't believe in this narrative because he believed in it then. But now he has flipped since then. So now it comes up quite often in his podcast, and when it comes up, he scoffs at it. And he's got this huge, huge audience. And a guy like that flipping from believing to unbelieving is pretty big. And I'm just seeing this all over the place. It's very encouraging.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I liken it too. I'll pick a little bit on our mutual friend Michael Schellenberger about his flip as well on commercial nuclear energy as a quality source of energy. To come out and admit that, hey, look, we had a different opinion then, and because we've spent time and we've experienced and we've looked at the information and did the work, that we're turning our position. And I could say that too with us in the sense of what we do. We often evaluate natural resource junior mining companies, junior exploration companies all the time. And our position changes over time based on experience, based on discussions, based on research and analysis that has come out since our original decision making. We're happy to admit when we're wrong, and we're happy to admit it. Other people sometimes don't like to do that. They're too proud to swallow their pride and say, yeah, I didn't do the work and I took this on a whim and I was wrong. And so always encourage people to be humble about these positions and really to, again, do your own work and just don't believe what's on the headline because we've clearly seen that a sequence of events, Tom, not just with climate change, has called into question people not believing what they've been told. And that has happened in more than one area of human life and society, as you well know, over the last few years. And of course, the one that went under, it's funny, these Section 501c3s talk about, oh, yeah, we're a nonprofit and we're doing this, but yeah, okay, but who's your funders? Are you really a nonprofit? Let's take a look at the salaries. Ridiculous, Tom. But anyway, let's stay on course here. Just talk a little bit about some of the contributors and experienced people who were featured in the movie.
We have a lot of high-profile scientists or scientists with great credentials. Like one is John Clauser, who won the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics with one or two other people. He comes out and he strongly pushes back against the whole thing. He thinks clouds are a much bigger factor on climate than CO2. So it's great having him there. We also have Will Happer, who is highly decorated. He's been an advisor to presidents. And Steve Koonin as well has been an advisor to presidents, including Obama. And these people, they clearly articulate the idea that CO2 is not the climate control knob. Just this whole narrative that CO2 drives the climate. And if we know CO2 levels, we know the Earth's temperature. It's crazy that people ever did believe in it because it just it falls at the first hurdle. It just there is not that correlation. You can go back at as far back as you want to go. And CO2 does not correlate well with climate at all. So we have a lot of different people that appear in the movie and with great credentials. And they really push back against this whole idea that climate deniers don't understand basic physics, because we have a ton of people who have huge credentials in physics. And the idea that school children can understand this because it's so easy. And then if you're a denier of basic physics, if you don't go along with the narrative, this movie does a good job, I think, of just tearing that apart. Uh, People in the movie, if you want to hear more from them, a lot of them are on my podcast as well. So if you like what you see of Will Happer on in the movie, you can hear a lot more from him at long form on my podcast. So that's something that interests me. Willie Soon, Will Happer, Richard Lindzen, they're all on my podcast talking at much greater length if you want to really hear what they think in a long form rather than just a minute at a time.
Whatever happened to debate, whatever happened to disagreement, that's an inherent right to do so. Professional debate, disagreement, and still be friends. What happened to that? But it's a societal health issue is actually what this is boiling down to. But we'll leave that for now. The individuals you mentioned, well credentialed, distinguished career for them as well. And I also noticed one of the other interesting things that they're also older folks. They've had their career, they've been through it. You also have to ask the question, of course, at that age, for a lot of these folks, this is at the point where they've already done their work. You look at their experience and context as well versus a young person who might look at them, look where they are because they don't understand an older person that has experienced their career is already finished or their career is coming to an end. That's another piece that I think is important. And it brings me into my next question for you here is that some people would, of course, suggest, oh, well, these people are biased. They're in favor of fossil fuels. Well, let's not talk about fossil fuels in the sense that it's brought lots and lots of people out of poverty and it's improved quality of life across the globe. Let's not even discuss that one because that's a whole other one we could probably talk about. But any comments there? But that these people are somehow biased, but have these people seen enough and they're willing to help others at great personal risk at this point in their careers?
Okay, yeah, I have a few comments there. Will Happer talks about this in detail in the movie that the incentives right now, if you're a 30-year-old scientist, the incentives are all to go along with the narrative. Because if you have a mortgage to pay and if you need to keep your job, you better kind of toe the line and not speak out because you can get canceled and you can get fired still for speaking the truth about climate change. So a lot of these people are retired because they felt free to speak their mind and tell the truth after they didn't have to worry about being canceled anymore. So that's a huge deal. We're supposed to think that these people are evil and old, and before the real climate crisis hits, they're going to be dead. So that's why they're doing this. But that is not true at all. It's because the incentives are all the wrong way, and even that's changing too. I think because these people are talking, are speaking out, because even on Joe Rogan, etc., on all sorts of, on Tucker Carlson, for example, too, as more and more people speak out, I think it's going to become safer and safer for other folks to come forward too. There's safety in numbers. I think that's part of the reason why the whole thing is crumbling right now, because of the whole safety in numbers thing. I wanted to go back to what you said about debates. So there was a high profile, I think, Intelligence Squared debate, very high profile, maybe around 2007 or so. And the alarmists lost that one big time. Every time there's a real debate, they do lose. And that's why you're not seeing more debates, because people like Gavin Schmidt are hiding from debate because they're going to lose. They don't have the science on their side. So I think whichever side is avoiding debates, you should be suspicious of them, because people on our side are just happy to debate. It's fun for us to debate because the science is on our side. And one more thing about the people on in the movie being a pro fossil fuel or pro hydrocarbons, I don't know of any of them that are opposed to nuclear power. It's you see a lot of alarmists who are somehow they're opposed to nuclear power, which you would think they would be all in on it because it doesn't emit CO2. But it's just really weird that if you look at people on our side, on the realist side, they're just happy with nuclear power because it's a great solution. So the whole idea that they're paid off by Exxon, et cetera, not true at all. It's all made up.
A few follow-up comments. Some of these groups you just mentioned, Exxon, maybe they should consider, as they have spilled themselves into other sources of energy, maybe they should consider getting into the fission reactor business. uh,
Yeah, maybe they
that
should.
one's absolutely one that it would be a very good point for them to take, and they just got a freebie. I myself unwillingly in some cases. I don't get to choose where I draw my energy from. I certainly get to give my opinion on it, whether that's hydroelectric, whether that's wind, solar, reactors, whatever you want to call it, wood burning. Some of the sources of energy we're using today, Tom, are pretty close to wood burning. That's how poor they are. Now, of course, I always enjoy a good campfire. While fossil fuels can be replaced for energy generation purposes, maybe not for backup energy in certain applications, but certainly it could be replaced on an industrial scale with things like commercial nuclear power. Makes a lot of sense and has made a lot of sense ever since the devising of that technology. That's the first thing, but also that naturally, right now, the way things are set up for us, we almost have to be pro fossil fuels because we still use them. I'm talking to you on some electronic devices that obviously utilize petroleum derivative products. I have a number of things in my office that are petroleum derivative products. We use fossil fuels probably in certain vehicles, or if we buy products at a store, they probably get delivered by a diesel powered freight truck. And so, even some of the clothes, different things we use, pharmaceuticals, so many things. I'm sure everybody's got at least a plastic item in their house that's made out of plastic. So, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, you almost have to say that you've supported it. You don't have to say you're pro, but you've supported it because you've bought it. You had a choice to make. The reality is fossil fuels aren't going away when it comes to products and certain processes. As far as energy, of course, you and I can have a good discussion about replacement of fossil fuels for energy. And that's why I mentioned that Exxon should probably think about diversifying their business as the time goes on here. With that, anything else you want to add there? And let me ask you, the next question came up was that, of course, many have been led to believe that there is an increase significantly beyond historic or even recent past records of wildfire, drought, flooding, hurricanes, etc. I'd like to have you just talk about that briefly, a few specifics. Obviously, it's talked about in the movie, but anything you want to add there as to if this is really valid or once again misrepresented.
Yeah, that's a great question. And overall, the years I've been down every one of those rabbit holes in great detail. And again, there's no signal at all that the weather is getting worse in any way. You can look at anything you want, droughts, floods, wildfires. You can go down the list, and there isn't that signal. And that's a huge problem for the people selling this whole scam because the Earth is absolutely not behaving the way that they would like it to in order to sell this thing. And Tony Heller is a guy that does a great job of looking at the historical data constantly as these crazy claims come up. They claim one thing, and he looks up the data and says, "Look how bad it was in the past." And in every single case, you can find out that whatever's happening now is not uh, new. It's not a new normal. It's just repeating that bad weather has always happened, and it continues to happen always, and it's not caused by people that you don't like. And I just pulled it up here as you were talking. IPCC did a special report on extreme events, and they said things like, quote, there is low confidence in any observed long-term, i.e. 40 years or more, increases in tropical cyclone activity, intensity, frequency, duration, after accounting for past changes in observing capabilities. So that's one thing that we have great observations now. And now, if there is a hurricane or some storm in the middle of the ocean, we can learn about it. Whereas 200 years ago, that might happen, we would never even know about it. They also go on to say about floods, there's overall low confidence at the global scale regarding even the sign of changes in floods. So there's no sign in droughts, there's no sign in floods or cyclones or anything else. And one thing I want to talk about is wildfires. There's this whole idea that when there's a wildfire, oh no, CO2 caused it. But an inconvenient truth is that in the US, if you look at wildfires, the acres burned in the first half of the last century was way higher than anything we've seen since then. So back in the 1920s and 30s, there were wildfires burnt mind-blowing amounts of acres, and it wasn't CO2 that caused it. There is a trend downward in wildfire globally, decade after decade, and of course, CO2 doesn't prevent fires, but it certainly doesn't cause them either. And I think there have been significant amounts of wildfires in the last 5 years that were set by humans, maybe on purpose to try to sell this narrative. People have been caught setting wildfires, and but even with the people, all the arson, etc., there still is not a signal that wildfires are getting worse. So I don't know if you have any detailed questions about anything. Polar bears, for example, they're doing well. They're doing way better now than they were during the 1970s global cooling scare. It's fun for me going down all these rabbit holes because in every single case, the alarmist narrative doesn't hold up.
Tom, thank you for that. And I appreciate the comments there. It very much aligns with other people I've talked to. I would say, purposes of context here, I know of friends that have been caught in these fires and lost their homes. I can reference Oregon a couple of years ago as an example. So anybody who's questioning me, you can just do a little bit of work on your own. But there was a region in Oregon of which I grew up in that was completely cooked, generally across the board. For the context of folks that experienced that, the actual victims of that, these are different perspectives and very, very unfortunate and very sad. And, I commend anybody who's been able to deal with that and relocate their life and build a new home and to look at the landscape of where their house used to be. But at the same time, the people that are speaking out in this particular case are not those people, Tom, in my opinion. Now, this is a generalization. My suspicion is these people that are speaking out about, oh, the increased wildfires and climate change, they actually themselves most likely have not been the same person that's been through that. You have to understand this for the purposes of context. That's what I'm trying to get across here. With that, I wanted to ask you further about, and of course, you referred to even, I believe it was 1910 wildfire in 1910. And of course, there's lots of historical records, including firsthand accounts of people writing about these events. And of course, they were substantial in terms of size and acreage burned. And then, of course, you look at the other side of things, like a hurricane damage. Well, if you bring a hurricane into a large, densely populated area, like places in Florida, well, naturally, because of population density and also because of the amount of concentration of capital in that location, of course, you can have record breaking economic damage just because of that concentration. But people miss that point and they just think, oh, it's a record setter. There must be a problem. You have to look at all the different factors and weigh how that actually works. And I just said it, concentration of capital and density of people. Start there. The other thing here that I wanted to tie in with this on what you said, asking you, and I think I already know the answer, but I want to repeat for the audience and maybe have you give a few other comments on an additional item. But is the climate narrative perpetrated in part by utilization of weather manipulation and intentional acts like arson in the case of fires, infrastructure sabotage, killing of crops, and these types of things?
Yeah, that is a great question about weather manipulation. And I have looked into that myself, and I just don't know how much of it is happening. But I found some mainstream articles as I was carefully looking at this. I think there was one that came out in the mainstream media in 2008 that said that in China, 40,000 people were working on weather modification. I found a lot of mainstream articles talking about, yeah, of course, we're doing a weather modification and cloud seeding. Another article said 50 countries were working on it. And just this year, we've heard of people admitting that there was some weather modification going on off the coast of California. So I do not know to what extent it's happening, but it is happening. Even with that, though, even with the weather modification, if you look at the data, like the intense rainfall, et cetera, there's no signal that it's getting worse. So I do think it's happening locally in some places. I need to dig in further to try to figure out the extent of it. But I don't trust the Bill Gateses of the world to not do this. You don't need enormous amounts of government funding to go off and to do some weather modification attempts on your own. And I don't know why it would not be happening, especially since we're seeing so much admission that it is happening.
No, it seems like it's a bit of a conditioning event there. And I think there's certain things we probably shouldn't mess with, Tom. I think there's certain things in this world we should just not mess with because the reality is we're imperfect humans. And if there's a mistake, it's catastrophic for everybody. There's just some things you shouldn't mess with. I don't know how to say that any more than just as an older person that has some experience, just stop messing with things. And you don't have to mess with certain things, and this is certainly one of them. But I would suspect, given the technology and capital that some of these organizations have, that it wouldn't be beyond, given all this has been investigated and tried and different things for many decades. There is the potential for certain technologies to be able to do these things, which could assist in perpetrating that narrative, as I alluded to in my question. So I'd like to ask you too. This is a newer title, at least in my book. Maybe I'm just I should get out more, Tom. But what is a climate scientist by your definition? Is that just a new fancy buzzword, or what is that?
Well, it seems mostly that it's used to disqualify anybody who is saying something against the narrative. That person is defined as not a climate scientist. Like there was the late great Tim Ball. For some reason, they didn't want to admit he was a climate scientist. So it's just a sliding scale that kind of, if you believe in it, then the definition changes so that you're a climate scientist. Uh, if you don't believe in it, you're not. So I don't know what the definition of a climate scientist is. It just, yeah, it's a very fluid thing, and it's just used to it's an argument from authority. Like Michael Mann, whatever his training is, he's a climate scientist. We should believe even that Greta Thunberg, that she understands climate because she's gone off and studied it on her own. I don't know if you call her a climate scientist, but we're supposed to trust her judgment. But then a Will Happer, a John Clauser, even maybe a Richard Lindzen, they'll find reasons that to disparage what they know. And of course, they couldn't know anything about climate because they don't have a climatologist degree or something. And I do think a lot of people, I I've heard this in many places. A lot of people have gone into climate science in the last 10 years when they already believed in the narrative. They were steeped in the narrative and they wanted to save the world. So I think that there is definitely a dynamic where people go into this with the idea they're saving the world and they believe in the narrative, and they're not interested in looking at natural variability. And as I keep saying, if you don't understand what caused all the natural fluctuations of the last even 2,000 years, then there's no way you can know what percent of the current fluctuations have been caused by humans. One person I want to just shout out here is Chris Martz. He's studying in meteorology right now, and he is doing a great job on X, kind of like Tony Heller, when they come up with these crazy claims about whatever just happened. He is another person that debunks it. He shows all kinds of data showing that in the past, whatever just happened also happened then. And this whole idea that we should panic about whatever just happened. We should never panic about whatever just happened. We should never assume that something bad was caused by CO2 because it was never caused by CO2 ever.
I think this overall climate change, the narrative, has created a whole industry. Back to what I asked, I don't even know what the definition of climate scientist is
Right.
either, but apparently a degree and $5 will get you down the road on that. But in this particular case, the narrative has created a whole new industry, and people are vested. So when you get vested like this, and you have skin in the game, whether you went to school and you start paying for a degree, and you of course come out of school like so many people think sometimes, and I should automatically have a job that's waiting to pay me $200,000 a year, or whatever it is, and of course they're let down. That whole thing has created this big industry that's driven by money, and there's so many interests here. The NGOs, as you know, these global organizations, which are extensions of government, that are backing these organizations, and all of the things that come with that. That it's also eroding freedoms and is allowing more control by central planners, which are generally, as we've seen in our experience, that are generally irresponsible and don't understand the real world. And then, of course, the promoters would never admit to the lie. You think it's overall awareness, like some of the work you've been doing, like a lot of the work of the people you mentioned. The trials and tribulations are really the only solution for people to that realize basically the framework that they're part of without really knowing it.
Yeah, that's a great question. That what is causing this to crumble? And I'm trying to remember the exact quote from I think it's Charles Mackay's Madness of Crowds, something about how people restore their sanity a little bit at a time, along those lines. I think that's what's happening. Is that just every day more people are waking up, and sanity is being restored for various reasons. A lot of people are telling me they'll say, I read something by Tony Heller, and that's what got me started down the path of checking into this stuff for myself. So that's part of it. I think just part of it is the simple passage of time that people are constantly told that things are going to get worse and worse, and next year is going to be worse. And as time goes on, they find out that next year wasn't worse. It's just kind of the weather's fluctuating all the time. So yeah, I don't know what's causing people to wake up, but this just can't last. This whole thing is just too stupid to last. The whole idea that our sins are causing bad weather and that we can prevent bad weather by giving more power and more money to our leaders. The whole idea that Nancy Pelosi knows how to prevent bad weather, or Joe Biden, is just too stupid to last for very long. Richard Lindzen talked about this long ago. He couldn't believe already, maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, he couldn't believe this thing had lasted as long as it did. But it can't last forever, and it is going away right as we speak. And I don't know what will replace it, but but sanity has to win out, and science is self-correcting, and I'm just happy to see it self-correcting right now.
That's just meant to be funny, so don't take it the wrong way. I can think of some places that are producing sins that probably have some bad weather as a result. Good comments there. I appreciate your thoughts on this. And it is quite interesting how the design's not necessarily working out so well. And good to see that people are doing their own work. And that is really the important part, because I think it goes back to basically, for example, they have their accountants and their lawyers and their doctors and these financial advisor, what have you, that help them make decisions because of their supposed expertise. And certainly some of them very well do have that expertise. But at the same time, it's almost like you're not allowed to go and do your own work, which is funny because everything about life is doing your own work. It's also interesting, too, that we, of course, have had these UN notices put on certain podcasts of ours. And it had to be a little bit funny here and say, well, who the heck watches our podcasts anyway that would care? But apparently they do. And so with certain podcasts, we've had to put the following notice on our podcast because we get these UN flags that show up on our podcast. And we basically say to the audience, our episode got slapped with a United Nations notice that attempts to advise our audience about how they should preemptively approach an episode of our podcast. So we say, check with your personal scientist, but our podcast may not be right for you. If you don't have a personal scientist, please check with the UN as they might appoint a biased one for you.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I have a few points I'd like to make here, actually. You mentioned doing your own research. I think there's a comedian named Jimmy Dore that I've become a fan of. He's talking about how they're trying to, in general, they don't want us to do our own research on anything. But he says that used to be called reading. And it's okay to read and make up your own mind about this stuff. And I think tons of people are, as I mentioned before, they are starting to do their own reading and they are questioning the narrative because, again, they've been lied to so many different times. And a big reason why this whole thing has happened, I think, is what the late Charlie Munger called a Lollapalooza effect, where there's been so many incentives pointing in the same direction. There's been so much money and so much power, and there's been social proof because everybody around you, it looks like they believe in it. So for a while, this Lollapalooza effect worked, and it peaked, I think, maybe 2+ years ago, where nobody wanted to admit that they didn't believe in this. But as it starts to crumble, that thing is going to go the other way and has been going the other way as more and more people are starting to scoff at it. One other point I wanted to make is that we could spend $50 trillion on this. We could give up our cars and never drive an internal combustion car again. We could all go live in caves, etc. And still, I say that 50 years from now, there would be no measurable weather or climate benefit at all from all of this. It's going to just keep fluctuating. So the whole idea that we can do all this stuff and we're going to get rewarded with less bad weather, it's not going to happen. It's because CO2 isn't the climate control knob. We can do anything we want, crank on that knob all we want, and it's not going to produce any benefit for us. And the last point I wanted to make is that I think for a lot of people in the general public, they may not spend a lot of time looking at this and learning a lot about climate. I think they're just going to notice at some point, they're going to say, huh, I used to hear a lot about climate change and now I'm just not hearing about it anymore. I've seen this in other contexts that instead of a big moment, a big revelation where people realize that the narrative was wrong, instead, they just don't hear about it anymore. And the media will go on and talk about something else. And we're going to look back and say, huh, they're not talking about climate change anymore. I really do think that is what we're going to be seeing several years down the road as we look back at now.
Well, Tom, I'll definitely keep my ICE vehicle, and I'm definitely not
Good.
trading that one in. When people start to realize the footprint of electric vehicles and they start to calculate all the materials that go into those, and of course the component replacements, which have a shorter life cycle than ICE, you'll find that, boy, is it really a net benefit other than the tax benefit in certain places? And of course, the tax incentive is simply there to suck you into doing it. That's what I wanted to add there. And then, of course, yeah, I think a lot of folks don't have time for this stuff, and they are trying to put food on the table. They have a job. They're trying to pay their bills, and that's the reality of everybody. Obviously, there's a few folks that probably have forgotten that, but certainly most people have not forgotten that. And so I think that's important. And then I think the other piece too is I think people at some point they're going to have enough. They're going to say enough. Let's try to not get to that point, but it looks like it's going to be headed that way if people aren't careful. I wanted to ask you this as well, and this is very close to us, and we think it is certainly possible with the right policy and the right intelligent people. And again, obviously, reversion and cancellation of existing policies. But can we be true stewards of the environment while also maintaining and improving standard of living, while also maintaining all aspects of freedom?
Yeah, I say 100%. That I'm a deer hunter and a bird watcher, and I love to go hiking outdoors. And this whole idea that people who don't believe in the climate scam, they must hate nature or something. Of course, that's not true. And I think it's a big problem that the fight against carbon dioxide, which is colorless, it's odorless, it is not a pollutant in any way. I think that's taking away from real environmental issues. Some things really are pollution. But yeah, focusing everything on this crazy fight against CO2, it's like fighting oxygen or it's like fighting water vapor or something. So yeah, I'm in favor of preserving land and habitat for animals and all sorts of other things. And good thing to remember is that use of fossil fuel or general prosperity that allows people to take care of nature. So if your only thought is where you're going to get your next meal and you might live on bush meat or something because you have to, once you get a little more get a little more prosperous, then you can think about preservation of nature. And the U.S., I believe, has been greening. I think forest area is much higher in the U.S. now than it was maybe 100 years ago. So I think general prosperity, and part of that brought forth by using hydrocarbon energy, that actually is a way to improve nature. So yeah, we can have it all. Of course, we have to have some footprint on the earth, but as we become richer and as we make smart environmental decisions, as we not fight CO2, I think it can be a win-win all the way around. And I did want to drop back. You mentioned EVs. I had something hot off the presses about electric vehicles. This is from Joe Nova today, I think, in Australia. It's called Electric Regret. Almost half of Australian and US EV owners want to go back to a combustion engine. Many in the UK already have done that. So for many people, the EV sounds like a great thing to do. I'm going to prevent bad weather and show my virtue by driving this EV, but the reality is not that great. So a lot of people realize that internal combustion engine cars are a better solution. And that was actually, we went through this over 100 years ago when cars were first coming out. Electric vehicles had the lead and they were beaten out because internal combustion engines did better. So we're finding that out again over 100 years later.
Appreciate you sharing that. Quite an interesting turn there on that because,
Mm-hmm.
once again, coming back to that tax subsidy or tax
Yes.
incentive, we've also seen people try to incentivize people to do things, just with the ice cream, hamburger, and fries. And so
Yeah.
you've seen this as well. Appreciate the thoughts on that. And of course, the challenges coming out of Australia with respect to their energy policy and how they do things over there, which is we have Australian friends, and of course, we shake our heads sometimes at some of the things that are happening over in Australia. I think people have had enough there as well. Also, I'm a proud supporter of paper straws, paper companies. Of course, I understand that if I'm going to use a paper straw instead of a plastic one, or I'm going to use a one-time use paper cup,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to go in the trash, and most likely it probably doesn't get recycled because recycle infrastructure is never 100% recycled. There's always new inputs, Tom, which people forget when it comes to recycling. There's
Mm-hmm.
always new inputs when it comes to recycling, and then you can never get a true closed loop cycle, at least in the current structure that we have. But it's funny, when people switched over to these paper straws and paper cups, of which can only be used once. It's not like I can go wash that straw and put it in the rack to
Mm-hmm.
dry and use it again, Tom. But I do notice from an investment consequence standpoint, of course, we have to say, well, this is very bullish paper stocks, paper companies. And so, versus a ceramic mug, which I might use 100,000 times for my coffee, of which just gets washed and reused. So, we all have footprints and effects. And whether you're switching back from plastic petroleum based bags over to a paper slash petroleum fiber bag, which is technically kind of reusable, or a straw that starts to go limp when you insert it into your Coca Cola, and you can only use it one time if you're lucky to even get through half of the drink, you have to sit here and scratch your head and say, are we really actually making improvement here? When you sit down and think about it, it doesn't necessarily look that way, or it does not. And certainly on an impact basis, it's not, because the trees Last I checked, paper comes from trees, folks. What are we doing here? Are we just flipping around? Are we just using something else that essentially was a byproduct because we still have crude products that need to be utilized anyway or be wasted? You have to ask that question. And then, of course, when it comes back to impact, you're absolutely right. We all have footprints. I mean, look at wind and solar footprint. That's one of the largest footprints I've ever seen. I can't even measure the size of shoe that is, Tom. But we all have impacts. I think last we checked, if you go into the restroom, you're having an impact. So let's get right down to the basics, shall we? Let's not forget about those things because we all do them. We're all basic creatures and we really haven't changed. We, even though people would like us to. So we have to have some laughs to get through here as well. Last thing on this here, and then we'll move on to a few things as we wrap up. But what do you think, Tom, in your mind, are potential investment financial consequences of the climate change narrative, either growing or coming apart? You can pick which one or both. And if you'd be so kind as well, Tom, are there control consequences?
Let's get to the control consequences first. I don't know if you're talking about something like central bank digital currency or 15-minute cities. Do you mean something like that?
This is obviously being perpetrated in part as part of control to basically say, you shouldn't, because of our CO2 content or emissions or footprint, we should do this and maybe not travel, not do this. Maybe we should stay locked in our house, these types of things.
Yeah, I definitely have thoughts about that. This whole, I think there is an elite dream of a central bank digital currency where they're keeping track of all of our economic activity, and they're going to make sure to save the planet that you don't fly too much and you don't eat too much meat and you don't buy too much gas, etc. And they're already rolling out pilots of this. I think there's a guy named Simon Godek who had a credit card in maybe South America, and already he got some calls saying he was spending too much money on on gas or something, and that he could pay a little extra to get dispensation so that he could buy some more. But I think there is that dream of kind of putting us in a digital prison and keeping track of what we're doing, and it's all because of this. We have to do this to save human civilization. So it's completely crazy, and I think we have to push back as hard as we can against that stuff. Same deal with this 15-minute cities thing, where again, it's kind of a digital prison where they don't want us to travel too much. They want us to stay within our certain zone. If we leave that zone and go to another zone more than 100 times a year, for example, then you have to pay extra. And again, the reason is that we're trying to save the planet. If you move around too much, you're emitting too much CO2. CO2 is bad. It's just completely crazy, this whole control thing. And one thing I wanted to mention is that the whole idea that CO2 is evil and that any effect of humans on the climate have to be negative, I reject even that. I think the warming since 1850, warming has happened since 1850, and I think humans probably have something to do with that. I don't know what percent, but that warming has clearly been good for humans, and it's been good for life on Earth. The warm periods throughout human history have been the good periods. And so the warming is good. The whole idea that we want to cool the planet back down to where it was in 1850 is just completely crazy. So CO2 is a net benefit. Some people have bumper stickers that say, I love CO2. And I would agree. I love CO2. It's great for plants. And the whole idea that we want to like bury it, we want to suck it out of the atmosphere and bury it, completely crazy. There was a Bill Gates endorsed scheme to cut down trees and bury them because there's carbon in the tree trunks. And that would be a good thing for Earth's weather if we could cut down trees and bury them. Just that's how crazy it is. There's so much craziness going on here. And the whole idea that any of this is going to make the weather better, that's also crazy too.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the audience can think about some of those financial and investment consequences here as well and pivot as they need there and think about what those consequences could be. But yeah, the biomass and some of this other stuff. I mean, like we have natural sequestering over time of CO2. Think of a natural gas deposit or an oil deposit in Namibia, for example, Tom. These are natural sequestered, and it's over the course of time and natural disasters and events. It's fascinating. Now we could spend so much time on this. Of course, we got better things to do with our day, and we have businesses to run with respect to some of these control things, as you brought up. I think it boils down to people saying, look, I've had enough here. I've had enough. When people have had enough, they've had enough. And there's not anybody that's going to be able to stop that.
I'm sorry. Let me jump back in there. I'm sorry I didn't answer your part of the question about investing, but I think that is important. I'm very much into investing. I like to go to the Berkshire Hathaway meetings, et cetera, myself. And I personally would not invest any penny of mine in any sort of a scheme that depends upon climate hysteria. So I'm all out on carbon credits and I'm all out on even I wouldn't invest in a company that only makes electric cars. I would look into investments that maybe hydrocarbons, nuclear, et cetera, any real form of energy, but any form of investment that depends on people still believing in the climate scam 10 years from now, I would stay away from that. I would not invest in wind turbines, solar panels, any of that stuff.
And that was an interesting annual meeting back, I believe it was May 6, 2023 in Omaha. Very interesting comments there on that front. With that, Tom, we know that CO2 obviously is a great target because you already said it, it's tasteless, you can't smell it, you can't see it, these types of things. So it's a great target. It's a trace gas. We know it's a critical gas to facilitate life, so we don't need to beat that one to death. We already have. And there's lots of good people out there like yourself talking about this as well, and why it is so important. That this is an unintended consequence, I think, that has come out. And we've seen this recently in some other countries. Guyana comes to mind, the president there, and some of these other places where people have just started to stand up and say enough of this nonsense. But do you think a nation that has had success and wealth generated for its people, and of course, Tom, you can think of a few, is in a position to dictate to other nations who have not had the same success or even the opportunity to have that success yet, or maybe geographically they can't? I'll reference island nations. Should they be subject to the same rules and policies as the nation who got to enjoy all of that past success? In other words, what I'm saying is, should someone in another country thousands of miles away dictate whether or not that developing nation and that individual family should turn on their air conditioning?
Yeah, of course not. Not at all. I would go further than that. There shouldn't be any climate policy anywhere. The whole idea of you're going to have a policy to prevent CO2 induced bad weather when that's completely imaginary. If I if I was in charge, I would throw out all that stuff. The whole idea of having climate policy or having some local council having a climate officer. So there's people with grandiose delusions. They think they're going to do something in some little town in the UK, and that's going to prevent bad weather in Tonga in 2070. It's just completely off the reservation, completely crazy. And I've had a couple people on my podcast who have done great work in the UK. They've stood up and they've been allowed their 3 minutes, and they've just ripped apart this whole idea that their local council is going to prevent bad weather. So I'm loving that. And I think it's Sandy Adams and Rachel Matthews. Let me look that up. But they've done just a wonderful job of pushing back against this whole scam. Nobody in a developing country should do anything, or nobody in any country should do anything to try to prevent CO2 induced bad weather.
Everybody should have that potential opportunity to drive self-determination, both at the individual level and also at the country level as well. So individual sovereignty and individual self-determination. That's really where it just gets cut and dried. With that too, I think, Tom, I have to add this. When you've spent 248 years of making policy, making law, and you do that first at the federal level, Tom, and then let's digress here and come down the chicken coop and go to the state level, and then go to the county level, and then go to the municipal level, then go to the district level, then right down to the homeowners association level. And you do that over 248 years with all the administrative rules and codes and statutes and all these things, and you keep making more. We'll just leave it open to the audience. What do you think happens when you regulate yourself to death? The other thing I wanted to ask you, but we both run podcasts as a portion of our work. As you know, we exhale larger quantities of CO2 than we inhale under normal circumstances. Should podcasts have a limit on CO2 due to the emissions they create?
That is a great point. And a point I do make is that in the air right now outside of my office, there's like 420 or so parts per million CO2. And right now, coming out of my mouth, it's 40,000 parts per million CO2. So it's close to a factor of 100. But anyway, the whole idea that your baby's breath is pollution and it's going to cause bad weather, it's not. And I still do wonder that if you talk to your plants and you're blowing 40,000 ppm CO2 on your plants, I think that could be a reason why they might grow better, because plants just love to suck down CO2. Will Happer says this about a growing cornfield in the Midwest in the summer. There might be over 400 parts per million CO2 around the corn right away. And a few hours later, it might be 200 parts per million, because that corn is just greedily, it's sucking down the CO2 because it's wonderful plant food. So if your car is driving past the cornfield in Iowa and it's emitting CO2, that corn is going to love it.
Once again, we got to have a bit of fun here on these things.
Mhm.
Really good conversation across the board here. And again, I just encourage folks, anybody in the audience that, we think these guys are crazy, that's fine. Just do some work, do some research, spend some time. And again, we all understand we've all got jobs, and you have to do this in your spare time. We understand that because my day job is not focused on CO2 measurements, but there are people that have done that for a career. We always recommend people do their own work on this. But Tom, as we wrap up here, talk about how people can get involved, maybe what they can do to get the word out, maybe what they should do, and then what you are doing next to continue your efforts.
Let's see. Before I do that, I do have one little nugget I want to throw out there. You mentioned the May 6th, 2023 Berkshire meeting. I don't know if you were there, but I was there. And there was a guy that got up and mentioned something. He asked Charlie Munger about gene therapy. I just wanted to throw out that I was that guy. Kind of interesting that that was Charlie Munger's last meeting. And I guess I'll just leave that there for now. To find my stuff, you can go to X and it's just Tom A. Nelson on X. And from there, you can find links to my link tree. You mentioned climatethemovie.net. That is one place you can go and watch the movie. So I would love it if you would watch the movie, and if you like it, recommend it to your friends. There are other people you can follow. Tony Heller, I would recommend. Chris Martz, I would recommend. There's a good community of people on X that are every single day, they're just kind of tearing apart the warmest narrative. So if you have time to get involved in that and come up to speed, that would be great. And I think it's great to talk to people in real life. If you're at some 4th of July event, people start telling you that the CO2 is going to kill us all. I think we should all make it a point to just push back in real life. And it's easier to just sit back and let them push the narrative on us. But I think we should push back everywhere because this is so important. Uh, so much is riding on this, and we can't let the bad guys win.
For sure, it's so much better than running around in the metaverse making these arguments. So it's a critical feature of community and social health that you have in person, face to face contact. And I'm talking facial expression in full, eyes, mouth,
Yes.
everything. And that is so important to having a good conversation, a lively debate about these issues. And that is what makes humans so interesting in itself. Otherwise, it would be pretty boring. We can all go to the metaverse and play around in electronic fantasies. But really appreciate the comments on that. I think you've given enough here as far as ways to contact you. And of course, people can see the movie as well. I believe it's on YouTube. I believe it's on Rumble and some other places as well. So, knock yourself out on that, and feel free to get in touch with Tom. Tom, it's been great. Really appreciate you coming on the program and agreeing to chat with us and spend some time. Keep up the efforts. And the community does owe this documentary a thanks for cutting through the noise and bringing logic back onto the table. Thank you again for the efforts and the time today.
Thank you, Andrew. One thing I wanted to mention in closing is that the movie is available. I think there's over 100 full copies of the movie available for free, kind of everywhere on BitChute, Rumble, lots of copies on YouTube. It is kind of everywhere, so they're not going to be able to take it down. So thanks again, Andrew.